George is in California. You're on Free Talk Live. Hey, George.
Hi, how are you guys out there?
Good. What's on your mind tonight?
I'm up in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and basically I know a little bit about alternate energy. My brother is one of the top 10 solar engineers in the state of California.
Okay.
And he has 2 solar companies down in Los Angeles. And basically I was listening to the conversation, and I've been involved in solar energy for about 45 years myself, and was studying it when I was 14, and I'm 57 now. And there's just so many wonderful programs and so many good things that are out there that are going on with alternate energy. It's almost like if you really thought about it, all the amount of time, the decades, that all of these different energies like geothermal energy and solar energy and biomass energy and all the ways of doing water heating or solar electric.
George, I want you to hold that thought. I want you to come up with, you said there's a lot that's exciting. I want you to pick the most exciting one and tell us about it in a moment. So hang on, we're going to bring it back on Free Talk Live. George is with us. You said you spent the last few decades, several decades of your life doing research and learning about and experiencing the alternative energy world, and there's a lot of different exciting stuff out there. Obviously things are getting better all the time, and I asked you to pick one. What's the most exciting alternative energy technology out there from your perspective, George?
I think basically you've got geothermal, which is like unlimited, and so because they can go down and drill these beautiful wells now, and places like Brawley Field on Salton Sea in Southern California, places like Geyserville, a couple hours north of San Francisco, and then out of Lake Tahoe, there's another area. So basically you got like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You could keep going probably for a while. Now, these unbelievable areas where they can drill for geothermal energy, and they've got like multi-megawatt plants just kicking butt.
Wow, so the idea would be you drill down in these hot spots and then build some sort of a distribution.
Being done.
You build a distribution plant on top of it and then send out power over power lines?
Yeah, that part of it.
You can also.
It's been done for a long time, so this isn't new, by the way. This is old.
As far as I understand it,
what's on the grid?
As far as I understand, you can also do small-scale geothermal for just a household.
Oh, I know people. I was in New Zealand. I was staying at a guy's house. He had 12 bedrooms. He was a doctor. His doctor's office was on the property. His house was located on a cold creek with trout and a hot creek with geothermal. This place was so hot, it was at a place called Rotorua on the North Island of New Zealand, that he had steam coming out of his front yard. Is that nutty?
Wow.
It must be a little nerve-wracking to live in that house.
I know. And not that far away, we'll say maybe a mile, is a hospital. And the hospital, there's a big mound there that's steaming from the last time that it blew up. And this whole area, I think, Rotorua is nutty. There's certain places in the world.
Oh, my goodness.
Rotorua is like thermal to such a degree that they have a place where all the people live in a place where all the streams and all the little waterways in between are actually steaming.
See, I'm sorry. Like, that's just so ridiculous. And that brings to mind for me...
Ridiculous how? What do you mean?
This is real.
It's like people who live in New Orleans. Like, you know that it's going to flood or explode at some point.
That's not how people look at things when they live in... Like, this location in the registry was considered the 8th wonder of the world. It was called the Vermilion Falls, and this is the little town below the Vermilion Falls. And vermilion, I'm kind of familiar with colors, but I'm thinking that's kind of like a coralish color.
I think it's a deep red.
Vermilion?
Vermilion? I don't know.
So these cliffs, they were called the Vermilion Cliffs, and in the 1880s, people were all over the world would try and get there because it was considered the 8th wonder of the world. And it was these beautiful hot springs, and they were Vermilion Cliffs, and they went down these beautiful, like hundreds and hundreds of feet of these beautiful steaming area, kind of like you'd see over in Yellowstone, over there. Anyway, so what they did was they're just doing their little jungle thing out there in the 1880s, and tourists are coming in from all over the world to see the place, and the whole place blew up.
Ooh.
George, thanks for sharing your thoughts and the stories tonight. I appreciate hearing from you. The toll-free number is 855-450-FREE. That's 855-450-3733. I haven't taken the time, like a lot of people who are really into the alternative energies, to do much, if any, research into them. But I love the ideas of, getting energy from different sources. The one thing that concerns me, of course, is having the government pick a winner, right? Where the government says, well, this is the most important energy source, and then they take your money by the threat of force, and then they fund development and research into one of those areas or more, whatever areas they think are important. And I think that skews the marketplace from what the people really want,
right?
What people really value.
If you think about it, people are always going to choose the more efficient option, and geothermal energy sounds very superior if you compare it to things like wind or solar, because those are ways of collecting energy so that you can produce heat. Well, maybe not those specifically, but like nuclear
solar,
energy.
You collect it into batteries.
Right. That would be like direct electron transfer, but something like nuclear energy, where you're just producing all this heat, that's just so that you can heat up the water, so that you can turn the turbine, so that you can produce energy, whereas this is just like the direct, it's just feeding directly up out of the ground. Like there's no additional process you have to add to it.
Yeah, I don't know. I tend to agree with Ian, that government shouldn't be involved in any of the picking the winners and losers. And as long as that's happening, and we've seen programs in Arizona, for instance, where they opened up the HOV lanes to people that were in alternative fuel vehicles, whether or not they had extra people in their car or not, and they were giving all sorts of weird tax incentives to people for buying these vehicles, so people would go out and buy the vehicles for the purpose of being able to use the high occupancy lane by themselves.
Except not for long, because then everyone will own everyone will own an alternative energy car at that point. And then they'll all be competing for the lane. It'll even out eventually.
Yeah, that's just one of the things to where, governments are directing people through different tax incentives. And then with electricity delivery, and of course it's opened up over the past, couple of decades, but for the longest time, the vast majority of people in the U.S. only had one company that they could get electricity from.
Right. Still that way. It's still that way.
Well, kind of. You can choose who sends you the bill now. It's still being delivered by the same company, but on paper it looks like it's coming from somewhere else.
You're talking about in New Hampshire. That may not be the case in other places. Like in New Hampshire, there's like the delivery and the supplier of power. And I think I forget who. There's one of those things that you can pick now in New Hampshire.
Basically, you pick who sends you the bill, and you have that option in most of the country now.
Really? Okay, that's news to me. I thought it was a New Hampshire statute change that allowed that to happen. So a lot of excitement among some of our listeners tonight about alternative energy sources, and I like it. I'm fine with the idea of alternative energy. I'm not married to one form of energy or another. Obviously it makes sense to have efficient energy. The more efficient it is, I like that, because efficiency means you're getting more for your dollar, and you're not wasting energy in the process of energy in the process of delivering the energy and that sort of thing. And our network today, the power grid as we know it, is a not very efficient setup. It's really not very great at all. Now, Daryl, you were talking about the deregulation that happened, and you said it happened at the national level, which is interesting. I didn't know that. I figured it was a New Hampshire thing, but
I thought it was at the national level, and I just pulled up a map of states that have deregulated to some extent the utilities. And there's a fair number that have deregulated only electricity. Some have only deregulated gas. Some have given people a partial choice on gas. Some have done a partial choice on both electric and gas. And others have fully deregulated. And it looks as though there's probably 20 states that have not deregulated at all.
Oh, that's interesting. So it wasn't national.
I thought it was,
Okay.
but
But it's
apparently
state
it
by
was
state?
not.
Okay, and also information, just to clarify the discussion we were having earlier, in New Hampshire at least, and again, your mileage may vary, it may be different where you live, but what has changed here about power delivery is that there's a big power company, the state-approved power company, PSNH as it's called, Power Supply of New Hampshire, I believe is what that stands for. They are still providing the delivery of the power, meaning that they own the lines and they operate and they repair, maintain the lines. But now you can pick from the supplier. So in New Hampshire, and I believe Maine as well.
Yes, New Hampshire and Maine, according to this map, and this map, could be inaccurate. New Hampshire and Maine and Connecticut of New England states have deregulated only electricity.
Can you do me a favor and drop that map, that link, onto our Facebook, Google Plus, and Twitter when you get a chance? Now, if you've not signed up for, or not following us on Facebook, Google Plus, and Twitter, please go to news.freetalklive.com. There's easy links to click into any one of those three there, whatever your preference happens to be, and then you can check that map and see if this applies to you. The reason why I even knew about this in the first place, because I started getting this deluge of email, or not email, but mail, like flyers from these companies saying, hey, now energy's been deregulated in New Hampshire. Now you can switch and save 10% on energy supply. So I switched. I mean, why the hell not, right? Like, okay, save 10, 15%. Okay, sure, we'll do that. And so there seem to be multiple companies now offering energy supply. The bill still comes from the power delivery company, PSNH as it's called here. So they still bill, but they're billing for the supplier as well. So the bill's broken down into the cost that you pay for supply and the cost that you pay for delivery. So I think that's great news. The more deregulation, the better. That means more choices for consumers, and ultimately I'd love to see more choice for the delivery of power as well. Right now there's still, at least here in New Hampshire, there's only one option for power delivery. At least if you're not going to somehow set up your own off-the-grid home, right? Like if you've got enough solar and wind, then maybe you could go off the grid, or I don't know if there's geothermal in New Hampshire. I'm not sure if that's available here. But if you have, some of these alternatives, there is certainly the possibility that you can disconnect completely from the grid and or send or sell energy back to the grid, which of course would be an ideal situation. But I'd like to see more options as far as delivery, and nuclear power could be a possibility there. But nuclear power is so heavily regulated that you can't build a new nuclear facility anywhere in the United States. All the nuclear facilities. Now, there's a lot of complaints and concerns about nuclear power, but I think a lot of those concerns and complaints are based on the fact that this is old tech. The U.S. government, as I understand it, won't allow new technology to be developed in the realm of nuclear power.
Right. I'm sure the restrictions are just strangling the technology.
Well, they're not outside of the U.S. There's development going on. I remember seeing some sort of online picture of a Honda nuclear generator that was like, something you could have in your side yard and have it power an entire neighborhood or something like that.
Well, see, just the sound of that makes me nervous. But then again, that's why, I feel like there's a lot of people that are just as nervous about something like that. Like when I was in high school and we were learning about this, most people, when we took the survey, said, oh, I think nuclear energy sounds like a great option, but I wouldn't be comfortable with living within 5 miles of one. But really, you should be more concerned about living near coal-powered plants, because those give off much more pollution.
Well, most people don't want to live near those. No. People don't want to live near the big wind turbines. People
because they make noise.
Right. People want all of these alternatives, but at the same time, it's always the not in my backyard sort of thing, to where nobody wants it near them, but they want to be able to benefit from them.
Well, so what we heard about not too long ago on the show, somebody had called in about, I believe it was thorium, which is some sort of a more safe nuclear option for power generation, and that's about as much as I can recall to explain to you why.
There was some automobile that was made that was supposed to have been able to run off of thorium, and it was supposed to get run for 100 years on 8 ounces or something
like that.
Right.
Yeah.
I read about
ludicrous.
that a few years ago, but the thing is that thorium is such a rare metal that it would be extremely expensive to have something like that.
I don't know. Let's see if we can learn more about that here in a little bit.
The thing is that I'm sorry, but the thorium, the molecules that they use are built in a specific way so that when they absorb energy, they're basically shaped like a swing set. Like they have both the molecular arms facing the same way, and when they release energy, they switch into the opposite position. So when they absorb energy, they just go back again.
You are clearly somebody who's cut out for chemical engineering, which is what you're going to be studying, as I understand it, right? Wasn't that something you're interested in doing?
Yeah, eventually, yes.
So let's go to Daryl in Austin, Texas. You're on Free Talk Live. Hello, Daryl.
Yes, like I was telling your call screener, I'm a journeyman ship and boat electrician, 20 years in the Navy, and one thing is I hear these talking heads talk about alternative energy, and most of them don't really know what they're talking about. Still the most efficient way to generate electricity is usually with a gas turbine, and the way some of these gas turbines work for these power plants, because one of my friends was getting a job at one, is they'll be running these two huge gas turbines, which are pretty much jet engines, and then they'll use waste heat off of them when they're running two at a time to run another boiler to actually run a third plant off that waste heat to use that energy to create even more electricity. And so normally they'll have like 3 of these gas turbines in a plant plus the waste boiler system to create electricity, and that is very efficient. Now, I'm all for alternative energy, but some places like, Texas in the summer is a great place for solar power, but not so much Alaska in the winter.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, New Hampshire probably not the best place for solar either if there's a lot of cloud cover. Then especially if there's not a lot of daylight either, that could be a problem. But yeah, I mean, different solutions for different parts of the planet. That makes sense. Anything else you want to share, Daryl?
Yeah, also the wind power. There was a case in Iowa, and right on I think it was at I-80, but outside of Des Moines, Iowa, going towards Omaha. There's like a school there off the highway that has a wind turbine generator. And when they built the thing, they had to talk about government getting in the way. They had to go to the state legislature to change the law so they could have a generator for that school.
It's ridiculous. Thanks for the call tonight, man. I do appreciate hearing from you. It's a story from Forbes.com. The thing about thorium, why the better nuclear fuel may not get a chance. And we can talk more about what it is that thorium is allegedly so great for. Says here, the Fukushima disaster reminded us all of the dangers inherent in uranium-fueled nuclear reactors. Fresh news this month about TEPCO's continued struggle to contain and cool the fuel rods highlights just how energetic uranium fission reactions are and how challenging to control. Of course, that level of energy is exactly why we use nuclear energy. It's incredibly efficient as a source of power, and it creates very few emissions and carries a laudable safety record to boot. This conversation, nuclear good but uranium dangerous, regularly leads to a very good question. What about thorium? It sits 2 spots left of uranium on the periodic table in the same row or series. Elements in the same series share characteristics with uranium and thorium. The key similarity is that both can absorb neutrons and transmute into fissile elements. That means thorium can be used to fuel nuclear reactors just like uranium. And as proponents of the underdog fuel will happily tell you, thorium is more abundant in nature than uranium and is not fissile on its own, which means reactions can be stopped when necessary. More coming up. As usual, we bring things to the table to discuss with you about whatever you want to talk about. But we also have things that we find interesting, although we haven't gotten to that yet because we opened up with a call who was discussing alternative energy, and that sort of led into a larger conversation, and now we're talking about nuclear power, and there's a story over at Forbes about thorium. And somebody had called in previously, I think, about thorium here on Free Talk Live, suggesting that it was actually a much safer option than uranium as far as creating nuclear power is concerned. And Forbes seems to be acknowledging that, but they say in their article here that it may not get a chance. And we'll find out why here in moments. Let's go first to Joe, listening in St. George, Utah, to KZNU. Hello, Joe.
Hey, guys. How are you?
Good. What's on your mind?
Well, I just wanted to not stand on my soapbox too much, but you guys kind of hit the nail on the head with before that. They're so worried about you hear the term renewable energy so much, and alternative energy kind of correlates with that. I'm an engineer in the oil and gas industry, and we make things called expanders. And we've actually developed a new type of expander that can recover a lot of waste energy in the oil and gas industry. And that's where I think people are really missing the point. That people are trying to look for this unobtainium type of energy source and something that's renewable and that can power cities all over the world with very little risk. And the problem is that it doesn't leave a lot of energy and resources to develop the technologies that we currently have. Everybody's looking for the new source instead of developing those ideas and mechanisms that we currently have to make them better. I'm all for nuclear energy, and you guys are right. The regulations are absurd about preventing nuclear energy, and actually coal power plants produce more radiation than nuclear energies ever do that escape the actual power plant. So it's actually ridiculous.
So here's my thoughts. Here's my thoughts real quick. Why not have something to where people are being encouraged to have several different types of energy to complement one another instead of competing with one another? For instance, there's, every building has at least 4 corners. So on government buildings especially, put up some sort of small wind turbine on every corner. There's a lot of roof space. You could very easily put some solar panels on top. Then you're having solar and wind complement one another. And I'm not saying I'm not saying get rid of the power lines running into, but have these other forms to complement that as well. And then things aren't competing against one another, but making everything better.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if you recall 10 years ago, solar was coming out, and it was looked at and mocked at that it was just too expensive, $1 per kilowatt. You couldn't produce solar panels that would justify the economics. But look at what progression has done. You can get about $1 a watt right now, and sometimes even cheaper.
Wow.
And for your own private home, you can power your entire house for that.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Well, it's okay. So maybe I'm confused about what you were saying earlier. It sounded like you were bemoaning that there's research going on in these other areas, but it's not like we want to have the government pick a winner and fund that one area to put more research into. We want the market to decide these things. We want people who are interested in solar to research solar, and
and that would make more sense, especially depending on what area you're in. You might have a better chance at one type of energy than another.
Mm-hmm.
Right, Arizona, Nevada, you're going to have more sun hours than over back east, for instance, or on the upper northwest coast. It's the problem with starting up and searching for something that's easy instead of developing what we have. There are technologies out there that people just need to put energy or resources in to develop instead of looking for this renewable alternative energy that solves all of our problems.
Yeah, and they really should, but how are you going to get people to, be motivated to do that?
You can't get people on the same page. It's just not going to be possible. I mean, it doesn't hurt to try to persuade folks like, hey, I think you should be researching this technology. But ultimately, people are going to pick what they pick. People are going to throw money at what they throw it at, and some people are going to lose as a result of that, and that's okay.
And it's like a rare genius that comes up with this great invention and doesn't sell out before he ever, achieves upgrading it 10 times.
But I mean, there are people who are putting research into, like you said, you're doing engineering work on gas and oil, right? So you're doing that work.
Oh, absolutely. The problem, for instance, we're actually a startup company. We've been around for 6 years so far, and we are breaking through into the market. The biggest problem that we've had is the uneducated people that are actually making the decisions, not understanding
and
where
those people are where?
energy in the future is.
Just to clarify, the uneducated people are in what positions? Are they in companies making decisions or government? Who are we talking about?
The higher ups investor groups. It's very expensive for a startup company right now. to break into a market. It takes a lot of capital and a lot of funding.
Sure.
And it's just difficult when people that do have that power that don't understand things about energy and what a renewable energy source kind of is, but what alternative energy sources really lie on, where we need to develop the technology that we have now. They're the ones making the decisions, and it's really difficult, especially for the startup businesses that do have these ideas that are developing these different types of ways to make current energy sources more efficient. Everybody's looking for the bandwagon, new fad, the new energy source or the new idea instead of just developing what we currently have.
I get your point, Joe. Thanks for the call tonight, man. I appreciate hearing from you, and thanks for the expertise and experience.
But let me just add that if it wasn't for new types of energy sources coming about, people would still be hunting wells to get the blubber to light their candles at night.
Right, we'd all be reliving Moby Dick every day of our lives. But but he did have a good point. I'm sorry, I was trying to get to that.
No,
I think I almost interrupted Daryl, but I stopped.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I made my point.
No, but he's right. A lot of people would prefer to be the one to find something new and shiny and look at this instead of taking the more modest route, but actually being more productive. If you were to develop something that already exists instead of going for something totally different.
Well, I can understand his frustration. Obviously, that's his business, right?
Right.
So, of course, he wants the venture capitalists and the investors out there to understand why what he's doing is valuable and why he believes that there's more potential in developing the existing sources rather than trying to find some new magical thing on the horizon.
I think there's potential in all of it.
Right. And that's why a lot of investors will put their money in different areas, right? Because they know that one will not necessarily work out, but they might want to be in the one that is working out, and they don't know which one's going to work out because, as he pointed out, the investor's not the expert. They don't know really anything about energy development, but if you can come up with a good pitch, then maybe they'll give you some money.
If you can make it seem like it's not as risky as it actually is, because I'm sure it's incredibly risky.
Well, yeah, trying to find something that's new sounds more risky than what he's talking about, which is funding development of existing technologies. So, speaking of that, let's get back to the story from Forbes about thorium. Now, this story is a couple years old at this point, but since we were talking about the issue, they point out here that, Ellen, you had said that thorium isn't very available, but apparently you did some research. You found out it's actually 4 times more available than...
It's 4 times more plentiful. It's just that there's no demand for it right now, so it's
uranium.
Not being provided.
4 times more than uranium.
Yes.
More of it's in the ground than there is uranium. That doesn't necessarily mean that more of it has been extracted from the ground.
Fair enough.
Right.
But if they were going to be utilizing
it's just in the
they
Earth's crust. It's not readily there.
We'll get into a little bit more about this here because Forbes magazine says that thorium is allegedly a better nuclear fuel, but it might not get a chance. We'll find out why. We were talking about thorium, and the larger conversation was about alternative energies, which led to a conversation about nuclear reaction or reactors, etc., and a discussion about thorium, because someone had called in previously, not tonight, but a different night, told us about thorium, and I, of course, I'm no expert at all on these things, so I just vaguely recalled that it was better than uranium. That's about all I knew about it. And Forbes has a more detailed piece here about that. So I'm going to continue. So the story here over at Forbes says that actually thorium is more available in the Earth's crust than uranium. And there's this conversation that nuclear is good, but uranium is dangerous, which leads to the question, well, what about thorium? Why are people using uranium rather than this allegedly safer, what they say is not fissile on its own, which means that reactions can be stopped when necessary? Because that's the issue with the Fukushima reactor, right? They've got these rods that are still going, and they got to figure out, what to do about that.
Right. You can't really stop the radiation once it starts going.
So apparently you can if thorium is involved. So it also apparently produces waste products that are less radioactive and generates more energy per ton. So why on earth are we using uranium? As you may recall, research into the mechanization of nuclear reactions was initially driven not by the desire to make energy, but by the desire to make bombs. The $2 billion Manhattan Project that produced the atomic bomb sparked a worldwide surge in nuclear research, most of it funded by governments embroiled in the Cold War.
And let me guess, thorium doesn't explode.
And here we come to it. Thorium reactors do not produce plutonium, which is what you need to make a nuke.
That's pretty terrible. I mean, I think I remember learning about this at one point. Plutonium, supposedly, just like one little speck of it, if you breathe it in, can cause lung cancer. So it's terribly toxic.
So how ironic. The fact that thorium reactors could not produce fuel for nuclear weapons meant that the better reactor fuel got short shrift. Yet today, we would love to be able to clearly differentiate a country's nuclear reactors from its weapons program. In the post-Cold War world, is there any hope for thorium? Perhaps, but don't run to your broker just yet. The typical nuclear fuel cycle starts with refined uranium ore, which is mostly U-238, but contains 3% to 5% U-235. Most naturally occurring uranium is U-238, but this common isotope does not undergo fission, which is the process whereby the nucleus splits and releases tremendous amounts of energy. By contrast, the less prevalent U-235 is fissile. As such, to make reactor fuel, we have to expend considerable energy enriching yellow cake to boost its proportion of U-235. Once in the reactor, U-235 starts splitting and releasing high-energy neutrons. The U-238 doesn't just sit idly by, however. It transmutes into other fissile elements. When an atom of U-238 absorbs a neutron, it transmutes into the short-lived U-239, which rapidly decays into Neptunium-239 and then into Plutonium-239, that lovely weaponizable byproduct. So when the U-235 content burns down to 0.3%, the fuel is spent, but it contains some very radioactive isotopes of americium, technetium, and iodine, as well as plutonium. This waste fuel is highly radioactive, and the culprits, these high-mass isotopes, have half-lives of many thousands of years. As such, the waste has to be housed for up to 10,000 years. And we've all heard the stories of, nuclear waste being trucked out to fields in Nevada in the desert and stored away.
Some mountain in Utah somewhere.
The bottom of the bedrock in the mountains.
So cloistered away from the environment and from anyone who might want to get at the plutonium for nefarious reasons. Thorium's advantages start from the moment it is mined and purified, in that all but a trace of naturally occurring thorium is Th232, the isotope useful in nuclear reactors. That's a heck of a lot better than the 3 to 5% of uranium that comes in the form that we need. So all but a trace of thorium is useful, unlike the uranium. Then there's the safety side of thorium reactions. Unlike U-235, thorium is not fissile. That means that no matter how many thorium nuclei you pack together, they will not on their own start splitting apart and exploding. If you want to make thorium nuclei split apart, though, it's easy. You simply start throwing neutrons at them. Then, when you need the reaction to stop, simply turn off the source of neutrons, and the whole process shuts down. Simple as pie.
That seems easier than pie, because pie, you got to make the crust and then add cinnamon to your apples and this and that, and it's rather difficult.
So a little more science here for you. That's here's how it works. When the Th232 absorbs a neutron, it becomes Th233, which is unstable and decays into protactinium-233 and then into U-233. That's the same uranium isotope we use in reactors now as a nuclear fuel, the one that's fissile all on its own. Thankfully, it's also relatively long-lived, which means at this point in the cycle, the irradiated fuel can be unloaded from the reactor and the U-233 separated from the remaining thorium. The uranium is then fed into another reactor all on its own to generate energy. The U-233 does its thing, splitting apart and releasing high-energy neutrons, but there isn't a pile of U-238 sitting by. Remember, with uranium reactors, it's U-238 turned into 239 by absorbing some of those high-flying neutrons that produces all the highly radioactive waste products. With thorium, the U-233 is isolated, and the result is far fewer highly radioactive, long-lived byproducts. Thorium nuclear waste only stays radioactive for 500 years instead of 10,000. And there's 1,000 to 10,000 times less of it to start with. So far less radioactive waste from thorium, and it doesn't stay radioactive for near as long as the plutonium byproduct.
Right.
And you can't kill people with it.
Well, I mean, if it's still radioactive, and I mean, 500 years in comparison to 20,000, that is much better. But still, that doesn't really hold much importance as far as our lifespan goes. We'll never be able to see the end of this radioactivity. Plus, if thorium starts becoming more popular, we'll have more of a buildup of the radioactive product. So, I mean,
But there's
maybe it could
1,000 to
equal-
10,000 times less of the output of the
right, but
the radioactive product. That's a lot less.
If we start using that much more proportionally, though, then it could, be a similar end product.
Toll-free number tonight, 855-450-FREE. But regardless, everything about it's better. It's not as dangerous, and you can stop the reactions instantaneously. It's Free Talk Live. More coming up. We're talking about alternative energy. In this case, we've moved on to nuclear energy. And an alternative in the nuclear world is thorium, compared to what we're used to, which is uranium-based reactors, which, of course, if you know about the Fukushima development, what happened a couple of years ago now, 2-3 years ago, I think, at this point. Out in Japan, it was pretty bad, where that meltdown happened. It made it very difficult to contain, as I understand it. I don't know if the rods are still going or
there
whatever.
was no way to contain it.
Yeah.
It just it seeped into the ocean, and there's no way to stop those rods from reacting. I mean, the uranium's
crazy.
already activated, so it's going to keep going until it runs out of fuel.
So I have to say, this is a really informative article. I'm not an expert on energy matters, and I like the way Forbes is explaining this makes it graspable for me, at least, especially learning that the reason why uranium is used, even though thorium is arguably a far better reactant, if you will, far better device for this, not device, but chemical is not the right
Material.
word. Material, there you go. Element, how about that?
Element.
Far better element for this purpose. The reason why uranium was used was because of the Manhattan Project, because of the research into blowing people up. That uranium was better for that because it produces, they're off the byproduct, if you will, of plutonium, which thorium does not do, and thorium is much safer, and so they.
Does it have something to do with how slowly it reacts? Because I know uranium has a very powerful, instantaneous reaction, which is how they create a bomb out of it.
No, I don't.
It said one of the byproducts of the uranium nuclear fuel is plutonium.
Plutonium, you don't get that from thorium.
And plutonium is what they put in the nuclear
Into the
bombs
bomb.
to blow things up.
I'm just saying, does thorium react slower? Does it
That's
give
not
off?
indicated here by any by all the indicators here. It's a similar reaction. It's just a different.
A different type of reaction.
Yeah, it just it doesn't. It's not. It is, what was it, fissile was the term that they used, meaning that it can be stopped simply by, all they have to do is turn off the neutrons that are being thrown at it, and then the reaction stops. So it would not have this problem that we have with the uranium reactors where the rods are just continuing to react because they are out of control. Because you can control it with this. So we're going to continue here with the Forbes piece because I think it's pretty interesting. And the title of the piece here is Why It May Not Get a Chance. We haven't gotten to that detail yet here, but we'll continue in moments. Researchers have studied thorium-based fuel cycles for 50 years. One of the other things we found out was that the nuclear waste from thorium is less radioactive. It only stays radioactive for 500 years. And there's 1,000 to 10,000 times less of it to start with. From any given reaction amount that you begin with, you get far less. 1,000 to 10,000 times less.
So there's less byproduct.
Correct. Researchers have studied thorium-based fuel cycles for 50 years, but India leads the pack when it comes to commercialization. As home to a quarter of the world's known thorium reserves and notably lacking in uranium resources, it's no surprise that India envisions meeting 30% of its electricity demand through thorium-based reactors by 2050. In 2002, India's Nuclear Regulatory Agency issued approval to start construction of a 500-megawatt electric prototype fast breeder reactor, which should be completed this year. Now, this was written in 2012.
What is a fast breeder reactor?
I'm looking to Ellen because I have no clue.
Oh, gee, I don't know. That was just kind of thrown at me. While you guys are
Look
Googling
it up. We'll figure that out.
I have an article about thorium here, and it says there's, as far as just known thorium reserves, India has 360,000 tons. And in second place, Australia with 300,000. And then
now,
United
is that what
States
they've already
number 4.
mined? That's already
No, that's
out?
just known thorium reserves.
Okay.
So they know it's there, but they haven't. It's not available yet.
I see.
So they've just kind of taken stock. But if you want to compare that to what the United States has, we only have 160,000 tons of known thorium. So we're kind of halfway there. If we end up producing ways to mine and efficiently use thorium, then we might end up like having to buy it from other countries at some point.
In the next decade, construction will begin on 6 more of these fast breeder reactors, which breed uranium-233 and plutonium from thorium and uranium. Design work is also largely complete for India's first advanced heavy water reactor, an AHWR, which will involve a reactor fueled primarily by thorium that has gone through a series of tests in full-scale replica. The biggest holdup at present is finding a suitable location for the plant, which will generate 300 megawatts. I presume that's what MW in caps means. Indian officials say they are aiming to have the plant operational by the end of the decade. China is the other nation with a firm commitment to develop thorium power. In early 2011, China's Academy of Sciences launched a major research and development program on liquid fluoride thorium reactor technology, which utilizes U-233 that has been bred in a liquid thorium salt blanket. This molten salt blanket becomes less dense as temperatures rise, slowing the reaction down in a sort of built-in safety catch. This kind of thorium reactor gets the most attention in the thorium world, and China's research program is in the race with similar, though smaller, programs in Japan, Russia, France, and the U.S.
So I have gone to the Wikipedias, which I know it's not the most accurate website to get information, but it does say that fast breeder reactors use some sort of stuff called transuranic from fertile uranium-238. A fast spectrum is flexible enough that it can also breed fissile uranium-233 from thorium. So you can put thorium in this thing and wind up getting out uranium.
The useful form of uranium that you can stop from reacting. There are at least 7 types of reactors that can use thorium as a nuclear fuel, 5 of which have entered into operation at some point. Several were abandoned not for technical reasons, but because of a lack of interest for research funding. Blame the Cold War again, says Forbes. So proven designs for thorium-based reactors exist and need but for some support. I think there's something wrong with that. Exist and need but for some support. Anyway, well, maybe quite a bit of support. But one of the biggest challenges in developing a thorium reactor is finding a way to fabricate the fuel economically. Making thorium dioxide is expensive, in part because its melting point is the highest of all oxides at 3,300 degrees Celsius. The options for generating the barrage of neutrons needed to kickstart the reaction regularly come down to uranium or plutonium, bringing at least part of the problem full circle. And while India is certainly working on thorium, not all of its eggs are in that basket. India has 20 uranium-based nuclear reactors producing 4,385 megawatts of electricity already in operation and has another 6 under construction, 17 planned, and 40 proposed. The country gets props for its interest in thorium as a homegrown energy solution, but the majority of its nuclear money still is going towards traditional uranium. China is in exactly the same situation. While it promotes its efforts in the race, its big bucks are behind uranium reactors. China has only 15 reactors in operation, but has 26 under construction, 51 planned, and 120 proposed. And again, that's of uranium style. Thorium is 3 times more abundant in nature than uranium. All but a trace of the world's thorium exists as the useful isotope, which means it does not require enrichment. Thorium-based reactors are safer because the reaction can be easily stopped, and because the operation does not have to take place under extreme pressures. Compared to uranium reactors, thorium reactors produce far less waste, and the waste that is generated is much less radioactive and much shorter lived. We'll talk a little bit more about this and get your thoughts coming up at 8:55, 450 free. Thorium is on the table for discussion. There's a neat article over at Forbes that we were talking earlier about alternative energies, led to a conversation about nuclear energy, and thorium is an interesting alternative and arguably all-around better alternative to uranium, which is an incredibly dangerous thing to use when it comes to nuclear fission, if you will. And now, to be fair, the history of nuclear power is one that's a relatively safe history, with a few exceptions.
Up
here
until
and
about now.
Chernobyl,
Three
Mile Island,
and then Fukushima. So there are a few incidents that are pretty horrible, but generally it's overall pretty safe stuff. But what they're pointing out here is that thorium is actually a lot safer. And there's a neat little summary here in the very end of the story from Forbes, which, by the way, you can get the full story over on our Facebook, Google+, and Twitter. Go to news.freetalklive.com to find all of those. But here's the kind of the recap, and then I want to get your thoughts. Toll free at 855-450-FREE. Thorium, they say here, is 3 times more abundant in nature than uranium, and all but a trace of the world's thorium exists as the useful isotope, which means it doesn't require enrichment. Thorium-based reactors are safer because the reaction can easily be stopped, which is the big deal with the Fukushima thing. Those rods keep going, and that's a problem. And because the operation doesn't have to take place under extreme pressures. Compared to uranium reactors, thorium reactors produce far less waste, and the waste that is generated is much less radioactive and shorter lived. To top it all off, thorium would also be the ideal solution for allowing countries like Iran or North Korea to have nuclear power without worrying whether their nuclear programs are just a cover for developing weapons.
Well, here's the way that you can actually tell on that is because the fuel-grade uranium is processed to a different percentage than weapons-grade uranium. And medical-grade uranium for like chemotherapy and radiation, stuff along those lines, is processed a lot less than fuel-grade uranium.
Okay.
So what they're doing over in Iran is they have already said, we will not process any fuel-grade uranium anymore. We will only do the medical grade. But the U.S. government is still saying it's a cover for building a bomb.
So should we run out and invest in thorium? Unfortunately, no, says Forbes. For one, there are very few investment vehicles. Most thorium research and development is conducted by national research groups. There is one publicly traded company working to develop thorium-based fuels called Lightbridge Corporation. They have the advantage of being a first mover in the area, but on the flip side, the scarcity of competitors is a good sign it's simply too early. Had it not been for mankind's seemingly insatiable desire to fight, thorium would have been the world's nuclear fuel of choice. Unfortunately, the Cold War pushed nuclear research toward uranium, and the momentum gained in those years has kept uranium far ahead of its lighter, more controllable, more abundant brother to date. History is replete with examples of an inferior technology beating out a superior competitor for market share, whether because of marketing or geopolitics, and once that stage is set, it's near impossible for the runner-up to make a comeback. Remember beta VCRs, anyone? On the technical front, they beat VHS hands down, but VHS's marketing machine won the race, and beta slid into oblivion. Thorium reactors aren't quite the beta VCRs of the nuclear world, but the challenge they face is pretty similar. It's damn hard to unseat the reigning champ.
All we need to do is convince the porn industry to build a thorium nuclear reactor because it's because of porn that people use VHS instead
Is that
of
right?
beta.
Was that because porn chose to be on VHS as opposed to beta?
Yes.
I wonder why.
I don't know. Probably price. I'm not really sure.
So this might sound kind of like a thick question, but what is beta?
Oh, Daryl, can you explain that?
Betamax was a competitor to VHS. And
back in the old days.
Back in the old days. Back when I was
80s.
just a little kid.
I remember
70s.
being at the video stores and seeing them both.
So do I, but you know, it was one of those technologies to where, you know, late 70s, early 80s was the VHS beta wars.
Right, back when VHS, you've seen VHS decks, I'm sure.
Oh, yes. I used to own an entire box full of VHS tapes.
Have you ever seen a top-loading VHS player where you load it's like this thing
yes.
that pops up out of the top and you load in there? Yeah, old school.
So a lot of television stations actually continued using beta until
Some
just
still
recently.
do. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there are some that still do because the resolution and the quality is a lot better.
Is it like the same shape and setup in there?
Yeah,
Like,
similar. I
is
think
it
the
like
beta tapes were a little bit smaller, if I'm recalling correctly.
But what it broadcast on the television, yeah, it was the same, you know, resolution what you would see on
right,
TV.
But it was like the setup was the same. It was a hollow plastic thing with the tape.
A cartridge thing. Yeah.
Yeah, just use different machines and different
So it was Sony versus
tapes.
JVC, right? Didn't JVC come up with VHS and Sony
That
was beta?
Sounds right.
Yeah. Didn't work out for beta. Anyway, let's go to your phone calls and thoughts. Habu is on the line in Madison. You're on Free Talk Live. Hello, Habu.
Yeah, good evening to you, and thank you for the courtesy.
Sure.
You know, just one thing for your third host who didn't know about beta. Sony at that time was at the top of its game, and and anything Sony came out with was really light years ahead. And so even in spite of it, it lost it. So it just tells you how strong the marketing was. But going to thorium, I'm so glad you mentioned this story, because these are some of the enlightening moments that Free Talk Live showers upon the waves, the ether. It was very good to hear this. I had known about thorium, and I believe the research had been done in either Norway or Switzerland, and also in India. And I suppose that the tie-in with uranium and the Cold War was the big catch, and that's what kept the research going into uranium as opposed to thorium.
It's tragic.
But the advantages of thorium are really so many, and also another thing which I don't think I heard you mention, but it may be in the article, is the legacy of uranium. You have this poisons produced at the end. You've got to dispose of it, and I think thorium's is much less poisonous, and also the half-life is a fraction of it.
That's
and
right.
then just one more point, please. You mentioned something about when it comes to Iran or North Korea building these nuclear reactors. I mean, have these countries gone around attacked other countries in the world? Why is it that people somehow associate these nations, and I have no connection to either one of them, with they should not have nuclear reactors? What's the problem with that? And I'm very sorry to hear that people like you, who are supposedly enlightened, are kind of perpetrating this myth again.
Well, I don't think we perpetrated that myth. The Forbes article.
Why did you say this thing about Iran and North Korea?
We didn't perpetrate that myth.
Fox News can say it, but why do you say it?
We didn't. The Forbes article.
Ian read something out of the Forbes article. That was not Ian's opinion.
Then we proceeded to discuss that.
Right.
Oh, okay. I apologize. I thought that was you just throwing out that line there.
No. Ian had read something out of the Forbes article, and then I dispelled that.
I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. Apology accepted. Anything else you want to share?
No, that's all. But I'm so that's the only way out from this global warming Damocles sword of hanging over our heads. That's the only way out, really.
You mean thorium reactors?
Well, thorium together with wind power and other kind of a portfolio made up of a number of types of sources, but primarily I would say thorium.
Thank you, Habu. I appreciate your call tonight. The other thing about beta versus VHS that I was recalling, but I went to just double check on the Wikipedia article about beta. One of the big negatives to beta, you're right, Daryl, it was technically superior in that the picture quality would be better of a beta tape than VHS, but you couldn't hold as much on beta as you could VHS. And so it says here in the story that in 1977, Sony came out with the first long play Betamax VCR, which had 2 recording speeds, which provided 2 hours of recording time on the standard beta video cassette, which they came out with this to compete with VHS. It already had 2 or 4 hours. So the default on beta was just an hour, which would mean that in order to show a full-length feature film, you would have had to have had 2 video cassettes. And that can be kind of clunky.
End of cassette 1. Please enter cassette 2.
Right, and that's not really a big deal with CDs, but I can't imagine something more cubic, like a thing that you have to insert.
Well, it would mean that you'd have to do it, you'd have to stop in the middle of a movie, pull the tape out, put a new one in order to continue the movie, and that would mean you'd have to rewind 2 cassettes rather than rewinding 1 cassette.
So much more time consuming.
Yeah, so that was a big negative, I think, for beta, and besides the porn thing, one of the reasons why it didn't work out. Hour 3 is on the way. It's Free Talk Live.
Free Talk Live, 7 nights a week from 7 to 10 Eastern, live on the Liberty Radio Network at LRN.FM.